tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Video games have been a big part of my life as far back as I can remember. Through the week, me and a few guys I met from school would get high and play each other online. Every Friday night, though, we'd meet up at James's house. Sometimes Connor would have his girlfriend with him, and she'd have one of her friends there, but usually it was just us. It was better that way, though. The setting was raunchy, loud, and you constantly had to watch what you ate, because you never knew what was expired. Not a place for women and children. James's eyes were fire engine red as he smiled and looked over at me, causing me to chuckle. "You ready to kill some shit?" he asked, as he handed me my controller. We'd been playing War Crimes with steadfast loyalty since it was first released a month ago. In our mission, we came upon an enemy camp after walking for a bit in the game. Our pupils dilated and were fixed on the TV screen with life or death seriousness. We crouched our characters down and belly crawled as we used the cover of darkness to ambush our opponents. I took out a good 10 or 12 of them, and I couldn't even tell you the body count for James and Connor. James jumped to his feet, causing the pipe that was sitting in his lap to go flying onto the floor. "That's right, bitch. Now tell your mom to make me some mac and cheese. I'll be home soon," he blurted out over his mic to the poor bastards whose characters' remains were now scattered amongst the vegetation. "Dude, you spilled the pipe. There was still half a bowl left in there," I said, as I got on my hands and knees and searched the carpet for nugs. Connor just hunched over in a fit of uninhibited laughter. As the night ended, we all shook hands, with our adrenaline still surging. "You guys still down for Tuesday?" Connor asked. "Hell yeah," we both replied. Then it was back to our ordinary civilian lives, as we had to put killing hostile forces on hold until our next session. Besides doing a few landscaping side jobs, James hadn't done shit since graduating from high school last year. His mom had hoped he would join the military like his father, who passed away a few years earlier. But rules and regulations, not to mention the UAs, didn't interest him in the least. I worked part-time at my uncle's paint store. Connor was probably the most ambitious of us all. He was working on his associate's degree at the local community college for, of all things, criminal justice. But at the end of the day, we were gamers, and we didn't give a shit about what anyone thought of us. The way I saw it, we were probably the only real people left in this world. I had scored 1/8 of an ounce of weed from my brother's friend Armando. He assured me that this was a high-quality strain that, in his words, could get you higher than 2 kites. But what the hell did I care? It's not like a 19-year-old kid can be that picky anyway. I promised myself I would save it for when we met up on Friday, and when Friday rolled around, every beautiful emerald green hair was left intact. I reached down and pulled the bag from my pants pocket like I was extracting a rare opal from the Earth's crust. I opened the bag and held it to James's nose. He took a deep breath and smiled like a kid on Christmas morning. "Dude, that shit smells dank," he exclaimed. "It smells like pine trees in an enchanted forest. Where did you get this shit?" At this point, I was pretty proud of myself. "I got it from the weed fairy," I said jokingly. "Okay, well, I wanted to introduce you to another magical creature simply known as Jack the Ripper." James dug through his cabinet and pulled out his bong. For whatever reason, that bong seemed very sentimental to him, and he rarely brought it out, so I knew this was a special occasion. He set it on the coffee table, then turned to me and Connor. "I don't bring this out that much. It was actually my dad's. It's one of the few things I have left of his." He lowered his head. "Dude, really?" Connor asked with a serious look on his face. James looked up, smiling. "Fuck no. I got this from that one weirdo roommate that lived here for a while. He left it when he moved out. I don't take it out that much because it's a pain in the ass to clean. But tonight, boys, we set the world on fire. He loaded up the bowl and we each grabbed our mouthpieces with anticipation. When he lit it, it ignited a flame that shot out of the top, only adding to our giddiness. "Whoa," James exclaimed as he backed away. "I think Jack likes it." Then he lit the bowl once more and the chamber soon filled with smoke. I raised the mouthpiece to my lips and inhaled deeply, taking in as much smoke as I could. The rest of the guys joined in, and soon James's living room looked like the scene of a structure fire. Me and Connor both broke out in a coughing fit. James seemed to enjoy the abuse, going back for seconds while we were still coughing up a lung. He looked over at me and motioned for me to take a hit. "Nah, I'm good, man," I said in a red-faced stupor. After another minute or two, the coughing finally subsided and I caught my breath. My head began to tingle like there were hundreds of fireflies buzzing around in my brain. My limbs felt like they weighed 500 pounds. I leaned back, and my body sank slowly into the couch, becoming one with the nicotine-stained cushions. Now, I for sure was not a casual smoker. Hell, I probably leaned more toward moderate to heavy user, but I swear to you, I was stoned off one hit. "Ready to play some war crimes?" Connor blurted out as he looked around for a controller. James slid a box in front of us with his foot. "Not tonight. Tonight's old school." Inside the box was an old, dusty Sega Genesis with several games. Now, initially I was disappointed because I was building quite an arsenal in war crimes and had an itching to try out my new rocket launcher on some villagers. But that soon changed. As I rifled through the games, I came across Demon Quest. I remembered the game, but this was the first time I'd seen the game's cover. It was a cartoon version of a young man in a makeshift headband who was holding a torch and a machete. He was just a regular-looking kid who looked terrified. It was a sharp contrast from the confident, hulking type you usually see as the main character. "Check it out, guys. It's Demon Quest," I said. "What's that?" Connor asked. It was like an obscure 90s video game that supposedly couldn't be beaten because it had no ending. I remember reading about it on a gaming forum a while back. "JB, where'd you get this?" James looked up. His eyes were so droopy and bloodshot that it looked like he'd had the worst case of seasonal allergies that a human being could experience. He just stared at me blankly. I waved my hand in front of his face. "Earth to JB." He finally snapped out of it. "Oh, sorry. What were we talking about?" Me and Connor busted up laughing. "Where'd you get this stuff at?" "It was my pop's." I smiled. "Like the bong?" He smirked. "Something like that." "This game is like a collector's item. Might even be worth some money." I looked at both of them. "You guys want to see if we can beat it?" "Fire it up," James said. We hooked up the console to the back of his TV, and I slipped the game cartridge into its port. Soon the glistening Sega logo appeared on the screen, and the main menu popped up. "Are we just taking turns?" I asked the guys. Everyone nodded. I had the controller, so I went first. "Kinda sounds like the music from Mega Man," Connor said, amused. "Every game back then sounded like Mega Man," I replied. I mashed the buttons mindlessly as I got a feel for the controls. I walked around in what looked like a swamp, where I had to kill these small reptilian-like creatures that would hide and lunge at me when I would cross their path. Suddenly, a hurricane was triggered, which instantly sucked these sadistic little critters out of the water, along with the plants and the trees. It was kind of startling and unexpected. Before I knew it, James was up and sitting next to me on the couch. "Fuck," I exclaimed, as my character got stuck in quicksand and perished. "Game over" displayed discouragingly on the screen. I handed the controller over to James. Soon, he began doing backflips and thrust kicks erratically. After he learned the controls and made it through the hurricane, he was left in a barren wasteland, battling different monsters and evil spirits. Before we knew it, he had made it to the next level. The scenery and music changed. and he was transported to a giant cave that was lit with torches that lined the walls. He seemed to become more enthralled as the game went on. "Dude, it's your hit," Connor uttered. James didn't respond. Hell, he didn't even blink. His turn ended after a demon's fireball caught him dead center, fatally wounding him. Connor jumped on next, making it through most of the level, but died after becoming possessed. It was my turn again, so I grabbed the controller, but died the same way that James did. "Maybe there's like a guide or some cheats for this game, because there's no way to even defend yourself against that fucking demon," James said, spitting out bits of tortilla chips as he spoke. I took another hit off the bong, then began looking up game cheats. All I kept coming across were these strange editorials, though. I stopped at one titled, "Why We Don't Know of Anyone Who's Beaten Demon Quest." I skimmed through the text. One line read, "An urban legend began circulating after a string of mysterious deaths that were loosely linked to the game were reported." What the hell was I reading? Was this for real, or just some video game nerd propaganda? The article continued. Demon Quest was withdrawn from the market in May 1994 by Sega. Sega's vice president of marketing stated that it was pulled because of the continuing controversy surrounding it. I sat there in deep contemplation, almost forgetting what it was I was even searching for. Finally, I came across a generic-looking game site called The Console Guru. It only listed 2 game cheats, and if you scrolled down the page too quickly, you could have easily missed them. One of the cheats was increased speed, and after entering the code, we were able to sprint past the demon before he could launch his fireball at us. By this time, it was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. Connor was asleep, and I was having a hard time keeping my eyes open. James was still going strong, though. I left a few nugs of the weed on the coffee table, and me and Connor drove home for the night. I sat behind the counter at my uncle's paint store playing on my phone when I heard the sound of a front door chime. Sal, an old white-haired man that would come in a few times a week, stepped inside. He was one of those guys that had a story or life lesson almost oozing out of every orifice.
"Hey, youngster, is your uncle around?"
he said with a smile of gold. "Uncle Phil," I yelled at the top of my lungs. "How you doing, Sal?" I asked.
"You checking your Facebook? At my age, you get status updates on your friends from the obituary section."
I grinned. "Nah, I'm just reading about a few games that are coming out." The smile wiped off Sal's face, and he shook his finger at me.
"Those games are gonna rot your brain. There ain't nothing good to come of them. Remember that."
His smile returned, and he winked at me. "Well, actually me and a few of the guys I game with were hoping to compete in the War Crimes tournament this year," Sal interrupted.
"War crimes? When I was your age, I was drafted into the Vietnam War."
His mind seemed to wander.
"I had a friend I remember that was tried by a military court for war crimes."
He paused introspectively. I smiled awkwardly. "Yeah, something like that, man." I looked back down at my phone. When Tuesday came, me and Connor logged on at home to game with each other online. Strangely absent was James, though. I texted him and only got back,
"Not feeling it tonight."
I didn't read too much into it, though. He would sometimes get tanked up on booze and disappear for a week. After his father passed, he began drinking way more than your average Friday night teenage binge. I think another part of it was to escape Rick, the man his mom remarried. He was a big reason why James was so quick to move out. He was an abusive and unreasonable prick that ran their house more like a boot camp. It worked out for us, though. James was the only one of us that had his own place. The decor was a sophisticated mix of pinups, beer, and car posters. A foosball table sat in the center of the living room, leaving it cramped, but providing immediate access when you just had to prove who could kick whose ass on demand. To complete the look was usually a stale Lunchable or half-eaten French bread pizza, sitting out on the countertop, somehow managing to evade the trash can for days or even weeks at a time. Oh, And somewhere there was a bedroom too, but the living room couch was usually the place that was used most for sleep. Some would probably call it crude and uninviting, but to us, it was like home. On Friday night, me and Connor met up at James's house, like usual. When we got to the door, it was locked. That was strange, I thought to myself. It was never locked. I knocked and waited outside, listening to a choir of crickets performing off in the distance. When James finally answered, he looked bad. I mean, he always looked a little on the unkempt side, but not like this. "Dude, it looks like you've been up all night trying to solve a murder or something," I said, busting his balls. James stuck his head out the door as if he were checking who was around.
I'm on like level 30 or something. I lost count.
Of war crimes?
Fuck no. Demon Quest.
James then got a crazy look in his eyes.
That's our goal, right? To do what apparently no one else has done. Beat the game.
Yeah, I guess so, I said as I stepped inside. "What's up, man?" Connor said as he followed behind me. The smell of pot smoke filled the room. James handed me his torchlighter and looked over at the bong.
Help yourself.
I lit the bowl and inhaled through my mouthpiece as the air bubbled through the water. For some reason, that sound was always satisfying to me. I took one of the biggest hits of my life and began choking violently. In the midst of my coughing fit, I could hear that generic 16-bit music begin playing in the background. When I looked over at James, I could see his silhouette as he faced away from me toward the TV. I sat beside him on the couch and watched him play. Me and Connor finished our last mission in war crimes in under 6 minutes. It's record time, bro. I really think we have a shot at the tournament this year. James kept playing the game as if we were invisible to him. As I watched him play, the game seemed to take on a surreal quality to it. For one, the speed seemed way too fast for the technology of the time. It was almost a stimulus overload for me, and I wasn't even the one playing. And then it was like it kept persuading him to continue. Random messages would pop up on the screen like, "Almost to Satan's lair," or "The sins of mankind depend on you." But then he'd pass another checkpoint and it'd just continue on. Finally, he made it to another level. Now he told me he was somewhere around level 30, but before the game screen changed, it said, "Jebediah has passed level 91. Score 208, 117, 401. Time 8:22. Level 91? I looked at the TV screen in disbelief. How could this be? I knew that cartridge video games were limited in their amount of storage, so how could this game have so much data on it? I finally spoke up. "How about we take a break from the old Genesis and put in war crimes so we can all play?" James stayed silent, focusing all his attention on the game. I sat up and inched closer to him.
Don't touch it,
he snapped. "Dude, relax." He paused the game and looked over at me. We sat in the dark, and the light from the TV screen cast an unsettling shadow on his face that gave him an almost ghoulish look.
I said don't fucking touch it. You were the one that said you wanted to see if we could beat this game, right?
Yeah, but not at the expense of your fucking sanity, man. James sneered.
I can't believe what a pussy you are sometimes.
He shook his head.
I've beaten The Legend of Zelda twice. I've beaten Wolfenstein 1 and 2, and I've beaten Dark Souls 3, a game that many would say is one of, if not the most difficult game to beat. Ain't no way I'm gonna quit before I beat this one.
I couldn't believe what an asshole he was acting like. You're ruining my fucking high, man. I stood up. Hey, Connor, I'm heading out. Connor looked up from his phone, then got up and stretched. I'm probably out too, JB. James barely acknowledged us. Before I walked out the door, I turned and looked back at him in dismay. Neither one of us had heard from James over the weekend, And as much as I tried not to care because of how he acted on Friday, I was a little worried about him. He hadn't been acting like himself, and I could still see that god-awful look on his face. Tuesday, me and Connor gamed online with no sign of him. I thought about texting him, but I didn't know what to say. The next day at work, I was mixing paint when I heard the text message notification on my phone. It was a message from James.
I think I finally made it to the last level of this game. I'll let you know when I beat it. Drop by on Friday. Blaze it.
That was James, short and sweet. I was really hoping he would beat that game. Not so much to see if it could even be beaten, but because I missed my friend. That, and the fact that it was taking away from the time we could be spending honing our skills in war crimes, of course. James! James! I yelled as I knocked on his door. I looked at Connor and frowned. The fucking door is locked again. James! I tried calling his phone, but he didn't answer. Let's check if there's an open window, Connor said. Good idea. I tried the kitchen, but it was locked, so we made our way around to his bedroom. I looked back at Connor and grinned. It's open. Here, help me up. Connor cupped his hands and struggled to boost me up as I managed to somehow swing my foot over and crash through the window. My pant leg got caught on a jagged piece of metal, though. I tugged at it as I tried to free it, then heard a loud ripping sound. Shit! I yelled. I grabbed Connor's hands and pulled him up. Watch out for that dagger on the window frame. After he was inside, I turned around and grabbed my pant leg. How bad did I rip it? Well, I guess I know you're a briefs man now, he replied. Fuck, I said, putting my finger through the hole. I could feel a draft go up my leg. As we walked down the hall, I could see the silhouette of James's head in front of the TV. JB, you better have a good reason why you made us pole vault into your bedroom. Now I got my ass all hanging out and shit. He just sat there, silently. JB, I said once more, but he still didn't respond. Hey! I put my hand on his shoulder and knew instantly something wasn't right. His body was stiff. When I got a glimpse of his face, I jumped back in horror. He had a look of agony frozen on it, and his mouth hung open like he'd been screaming. The controller still rested in his lap. What the fuck is going on? Connor said as he walked up. I think he's dead, I said in shock. Suddenly, we heard that familiar music begin blasting from the speakers, and the game started up. Level after level began to flash across the TV screen, like the game just kept endlessly building one after another. Level 300, 400. Finally, after about level 700, the screen just flickered like a strobe light. Then, it went black. Game over displayed, and organ music played depressingly as a list of usernames and their high scores scrolled down the screen. I looked closely, and a few names down was JB_02, 503,114,072. For Christ's sake, was this James's initials? I thought to myself. Were all the other scores people who died while playing this game too? I hit the power button on the Sega, then turned to James and draped a blanket over his body. I couldn't bear to see him like that. Connor just sat there with his head in his hands until the police arrived. One of the deputies pulled the sheet off of James's face.
Jesus,
he exclaimed. He looked over at me.
You should have warned me first.
We heard that James's death was ruled as SUDEP, or sudden unexplained death in epilepsy. Despite what the medical examiner may have called it, we knew what it was. It was that game. That game was evil. I met up at Connor's house the following Friday after work, but not to play video games. You know what we need to do, I said to him. He nodded. I called James's mom and told her I left my backpack at his house and asked if I could pick it up. She met us there sometime later and unlocked the door to let me in as she waited outside. I could tell she was uncomfortable and didn't want to be there, so I tried to be quick. The truth was, I didn't leave my backpack at his house. I grabbed Demon Quest out of the Sega and put it back in its case, then slipped it into my waistband. Sorry, Cindy, I guess I didn't leave it here after all. She turned to me with tears in her eyes and hugged me tightly without saying anything. I so desperately wanted to tell her what I was doing here, what had really happened, but I just couldn't because it sounded almost unbelievable, even to me. The next day we headed up to the mountains, staying quiet most of the way. When I found a spot where the brush thinned, I pulled over to the side of the road. I grabbed a shovel from the back seat, and Connor pulled out a bottle of lighter fluid and some matches from his backpack. I cleared away a spot and tossed the game onto the ground. We both looked at each other. This one's for James, Connor said. He doused the game with lighter fluid and struck a match. We watched the flames rise before slowly burning out, leaving behind a small pile of ashes. I pulled a pinner joint from behind my ear and lit it. I took a hit and passed it to Connor. I can almost feel James here with us, hogging the joint like he used to. Stingy bastard, I said, choked up. It's been a year since James's passing. Me and Connor still haven't spoken about that night, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to play those types of games again without being reminded of what happened. We often think of classic video games as basic and one-dimensional, an easy-going, nostalgic trip through time. But before you go trying to find that game you vaguely remember playing as a kid, just remember that sometimes there are some that are better left forgotten.
I don't exactly know how to start this. I could get philosophical and talk about how I'm being haunted by my whole worldview shaking, but that would be getting ahead of myself. I may be dead soon, so I won't waste time with articulation. I must merely relay my experience as I experienced it to the best of my ability. It started around a half a month ago. I was looking for a temp job and saw an ad asking for someone who could come over and care for a very special eel. The ad's poster, Igor, would be going on vacation for around 2 weeks, and he was willing to hire even someone with no experience and train that person upon meeting. I know virtually nothing about fish, but I'm very responsible with pets, so I contacted him saying that. In a surprisingly short amount of time, he replied and invited me over. Igor Seligman lived a bit on the outskirts of town in a fairly large house that looked like it could feasibly have had 3 floors, but had only 2. I suspected he was fairly wealthy and that he'd already done a lot of traveling, considering his house was full of exotic decorations that seemed like they came from other countries, which I mostly didn't know, some paintings. So a standard yuppie house. But then midway through the living room, with a decorous mahogany table between it and the kitchen, was a towering home aquarium, wherein dealt my source of income for the next 2 weeks. Igor's eel, MacGyver, was a dark brown fellow, with big but vacuous eyes, a surprisingly drab-looking fish compared to what you may expect from such a meticulously decorated home. There was also nothing exotic about caring for MacGyver, but I know little about fish, so I was fine with the easy load. I mostly had to get a frozen shrimp out of the freezer and drop it in his tank. Igor gave me the number of a fish vet to call if MacGyver didn't eat for a while. Fish vets are a thing, apparently, but he said there would likely be no issues there. I was surprised by how soon Igor planned to leave on his trip after hiring me and handing me the key. The next week, I went over my first shift. It couldn't have been even 5 minutes of my time taking a shrimp from the freezer and feeding it to MacGyver, and as Mr. Seligman had suspected, the eel had a normal appetite. I left soon afterward, which was about as eventful as I expected this to get for the whole time of Igor's trip. On the second day, though, things had been going badly for me. I had to run several errands, got stuck in traffic, and then had to stand in line at the post office. So after rushing over to Mr. Seligman's house right after, I was in the mood to just sit and chill for a while. I gave MacGyver his shrimp. The eel, this time swimming up near the surface in anticipation, and then slumped on the couch. There was no TV though, so I got bored and decided to look around the house. Probably unprofessional, but this house was interesting, if only because much in it was unusual. And so I went through several rooms full of souvenirs. I found one unusual door in one of the 2 halls from the living room. Unlike the others, it was covered with paper paraphernalia, a Jurassic Park poster, a photo of a children's soccer team, some rather average colored pencil drawings of the Power Rangers, Woody and Buzz from Toy Story, and a sign with stylized colored letters reading, Ike's Room. The door stood out, not just for its unique decoration, but because this looked like a typical kid's room door, and Mr. Seligman had never mentioned having any children. It was feasible that Ike was merely at school or somewhere else when Igor met and hired me. But I'm confident that when Igor described his vacation plans to me, he always used the pronoun I and not we. Also, he just seemed like he wasn't the sort of man to have children. But I wasn't pondering too deeply about this. I was simply curious, so I went in against what should have been my better judgment. A cloud of dust wafted up from the carpet as I strolled in, and I teared up a bit. I only noticed dust on that carpet and the bed as it rose up. But on harder surfaces, such as a few cabinets, some cans of things, and a mirror, it rendered what had once been glossy and colorful into a dull whitish color. At least I didn't notice any spider webs, but I wouldn't have been surprised to see them. Whoever Ike was, it seemed he hadn't been home for quite a while. I wasn't sure why, but somehow this depressed me a lot. I'm not a judgmental man, but if pushed, I won't deny that my tastes are more along the lines of this one bedroom, so full of youthful vigor and popular culture, than the rest of the house with its prominent, but to me, rather meaningless displays of high culture. And so seeing this be the one part of the house that was not kept in immaculate condition may have been what saddened me. So I decided I would fix things up. I had no intention of raiding Igor's closets looking for cleaning supplies, but the next day I brought my own vacuum cleaner, a face mask, and some wet wipes to the house. This time, shortly after I opened the door, MacGyver came to the surface of his tank and looked in my direction. And even after feeding him, he seemed a bit interested in what I was doing. I went back to Ike's room, put the mask over my mouth and nose, and started using the wet wipes to wipe off the dust off every hard surface I saw. I had just wiped off an old TV set on a cabinet and proceeded to dust off a stack of boxes down below when I uncovered something that shocked me. Staring out at me, newly dust-free, was a copy of Sonic Extreme for the Sega Saturn. No way! That game doesn't exist! It had been in development, but it was simply too ahead of its time and canceled. I looked around, and sure enough, nearby, angled away, but still connected to the TV, was the ill-fated Sega Saturn console, a black rounded rectangle slab with a disk drive on top. I collected my thoughts and started wiping the dust from the console, letting shine its glossy black sheen of the sort Sega so loved in the 1990s. As I did that and moved on to the rest of the furniture, I started to rationalize the anomalous game. It must have been a bootleg sold at a flea market, likely using the name of a canceled game to con someone into buying something else. As based on what I've read, Sonic Extreme wouldn't even have worked on Saturn, at least not without the sort of slowdown that would have ruined a Sonic game. Yet I was still rather interested in playing it, so I finished cleaning off the dust, threw away the wipes, with MacGyver coming out to see me as I walked into the kitchen, and then vacuumed the carpet in Ike's room. Then, I put the game in the Sega Saturn, was pleased to discover that both it and the TV still worked, and began to play Sonic Extreme. And it was. Everything I had seen and heard about Sonic Extreme, which wasn't a lot at the time it was being made, but increased as its alumni told their stories on the internet, was in this game. You could play as Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Tiara Bobowski, a Sonic character never seen before or since. And for some characters, the camera would get a fisheye lens effect. It was a colorful game with fantastic music, and I reveled in being a rare person who has played this lost game for some factors I could not explain. For a while, by now, it's an old joke among anyone who is even a little bit familiar with the Sonic the Hedgehog series that it has had a rough start since going 3D. While some of the 3D Sonic games have a dedicated following, others are generally regarded as ranging from only sectionally good to terrible on many levels. This game I was playing, though not broken, was still a product of its time. It was made before people at Sega had clear insight into how to make a Sonic game in 3D. Also, at a time when merely being 3D was such a novelty, people might overlook that this didn't feel like a Sonic game in many cases. While its frame rate did not drop much, the level design didn't facilitate going fast, and as such, I grew a bit bored with it as it paled compared to several Sonic games made both before and after it. I intended to finish it eventually but needed a break, so I decided to look through the other games in the stack. The next game there was Rayman, the original one that was also on PlayStation 1. Good game, but it's one I've played already. So I went, and again was surprised to see a game called Rowdy Rodney. I'd never heard of this game, but I certainly recognized Rodney himself, a white, wing-tipped suit like in some kung fu movies, the late 80s, early 90s flat-top hairdo, and a bandage on his cheek. His mouth was open in an angry expression as he kicked down a door toward the viewer. His foot seemed oversized due to perspective, and he held a folding chair in one hand. This Rodney guy looked exactly like Kunio-kun, the mascot of the late Technos company, which got renamed in foreign releases of his games. In the rare cases, they got foreign releases. Sure enough, the Technos logo was there in the lower left of the box. I had never heard of this game, or whatever it had been called in Japan, so I turned it over to look at the screenshots on the back, and got an even greater shock. This game was in primitive mid-1990s 3D, and at the bottom, I saw a copyright record from 1998. But Technos had gone bankrupt in 1996. How did this exist? I leaned back and looked around the room, almost as if I was expecting some paranormal entity to be watching me. I looked back at the games in front of me, verifying that Sonic Extreme and Rowdy Rodney were real and present, and accepted what must be happening. Reality must be glitching, so to speak, and whatever that meant. I had somehow stumbled into an alternate universe, or perhaps a piece of it had stumbled into my universe, or perhaps someone had brought some video games back from an alternate reality. Thinking this, I got up and walked into the living room, MacGyver again swimming out to greet me, and looked at all the odd decorations. I had figured that the Seligmans did a lot of travel abroad, but what if it wasn't just to foreign countries? What if they somehow traversed dimensions? You know what? I thought. That's awesome! I could imagine a lot of terrible alternate universes where something had gone horribly wrong, and so I personally wouldn't risk traveling between them. But these Seligmans knew how to play it safe and brought back interesting things from alternate universes. I was already fantasizing about what other sort of video games would exist in those alternate realities. Was there a reality where Sega hadn't exited the console race, or even Atari hadn't? Or what about one where Nintendo had never entered the console race? An alternate reality where Rareware had made 12 Tales, Conquer 64, or Dream? What about one where Nintendo never sold them, and we got Banjo-Kazooie 3 on the GameCube? I was salivating about what games existed across the multiverse, and how some could even be stored somewhere in this house. But though I'd already been way too nosy, I resolved to draw the line before rummaging through anything closed here. Besides, there was a fair amount more Sega Saturn games in that stack, so I went back to Ike's room. I examined more of the games in the stack. Beneath Rowdy Rodney was Bug, a game that existed in this universe, though it had been mostly forgotten. Next was a jet fighter combat game called Eagles on the Edge. Then what looked like a JRPG starring a Maneko-Neko-like character entitled Picrovius. both of which I had never heard of. I attempted to look up these games on my phone to see if they were more than almost existed in this universe, but it couldn't access the internet from here, so I'd save that for later. I kept looking through these games and found one that shocked me and made me start laughing out loud. Smirking at me from the box art was a face I hadn't seen since the 1990s and hadn't exactly hoped to see again. It was Joe Camel, for a time the ostensibly cool mascot of Camel cigarettes, and only retired on government orders because he appealed mostly to children. I never really examined statistics about all that. Still, there was no doubt that Joe existed to forge an association between cool things and smoking Camel cigarettes. It may well have been that video games being infected by that campaign was a bullet our universe only narrowly dodged. Yet, here was a glimpse of what might have been in a grimmer reality, a game entitled Joe Camel in the Mystery of Menthol Mountain. Unlike the last few unfamiliar games I had gone through, I couldn't just stop at a glimpse of this one, so I popped it in the Saturn and began. To my surprise, this game was great. It opened with a 3D music video of Joe Camel singing a catchy song in his band, the Hard Pack. Then the plot began, about how the Hard Pack were about to go on tour but had not returned from a trip to Menthol Mountain. It was up to Joe Camel to smoke his way through an epic and surreal quest to rescue them. As Joe ventured up Menthol Mountain, he discovered a cave, and after entering it, he found himself in a room full of doors, most of which were locked, but one which could be entered. You might be thinking this was another game like Super Mario 64, what with levels being accessed via a 3D overworld. It sort of was, but this game had more of a combat component, with various melee weapons such as switchblades, chains, and pool cues, and some projectiles like a revolver and a flamethrower. Various styles of Camel cigarettes could be smoked to give Joe special powers. For example, Camel Lights made Joe jump higher, and Turkish Gold increased the range and damage of projectiles. Joe could ride a motorcycle too. Oh, and as you might guess, cigarettes were also involved. The levels of this game were also really cool, many exploring environmental archetypes that most other games don't, such as Monument Valley in the American Southwest, the Ottoman Empire, and a tobacco farm in Virginia, plus many surreal colors. The music was killer, more of the bluesy stuff that the Hard Pack band had played at the start, plus some great ambient music. There also seemed to be some inexplicable strobe effect in the game, and some might have found that obnoxious, but I didn't mind. I figured that maybe this was a result of an old disc getting damaged, and I worried the whole game would break, but it never did. To put it shortly, I was hooked on this game. When I first saw it, I only wanted to play it so I could laugh at something embarrassingly stupid, but it turned out to be an incredibly well-made and creative game, and I craved the surprises and sensory stimulation that seemed to lie around every corner. So that week and the next flew by. I looked forward to every day going to feed MacGyver, who by now had grown quite friendly toward me, and then playing more of Joe Camel's exotic adventures. On Monday of the second week, I stopped at a gas station on the way to Igor Seligman's house, and when I saw a pack of Camel cigarettes on the rack, I smiled, laughed even. I had some reservations, but then I figured, what the hell? I don't have an addictive personality, except when it comes to fantastic video games, and as Stewie Griffin once said, what doesn't cause cancer these days? So I threw caution to the wind, bought a pack, and lit up. I'd never smoked before, and maybe this is just because that game had made the act seem more amusing, but I enjoyed it. I would celebrate each shift with a Camel before entering Igor's house and sometimes afterwards. Sometimes I even smoked them at home, and so it went for the rest of the week. I was sad when Igor Seligman returned home, as I hadn't quite finished Joe Camel in the Mystery of Menthol Mountain. As Igor paid me a fairly generous sum for the odd task of feeding his eel for 2 weeks, I said, "Thanks. Hey, I have a question." Igor invited me to go on, and I had intended to ask if I could keep coming over to finish the game, but then I realized what asking this would entail. I would have to admit to Mr. Seligman that I had gone exploring in his house, or to be more honest, snooping. I had found Ike's room, his Sega Saturn, and his exotic video games, and most troubling, I had suspected the Seligmans of doing some sort of interdimensional travel. As I considered all that, I decided not. But with Igor prompting me to continue, I figured I had to say something. So I continued, "Do you have any children?" Igor abruptly frowned as he said, "No. You saw Ike's room while going to the bathroom, didn't you?" Yes, that's right," I said, glad to grab onto the tame alibi he had given me. Igor then gave me an explanation I wasn't ready for, not even after all my suspicions of multiverse hopping. You see, Ike was my older brother. He and I weren't very similar, but I loved him. He was the sort that was impossible not to love. Sadly, he died of cancer, tragically young. I had never heard of someone dying of it that young, but Ike did love his cigarettes. We all have our faults. He was just more deadly than usual. When he was close to the end, he made me promise to take care of MacGyver. You couldn't believe a kid could love an eel so much, but he did, and I think MacGyver even loved him back. It's still too sad for me to go into Ike's room, but I apologize. I've gone on too long and made you sad. Good luck in whatever you've got ahead." I thanked Mr. Seligman, doing my best not to show how uneasy I'd become, and left the place shaking with fear so much that I barely managed to drive home without an accident. Good luck? Yes, I was going to need it. Here I had been, ecstatic at discovering that not only was traveling the multiverse a real thing, but someone had brought back souvenirs from an exotic alternate universe cooler than mine. But looks can be deceiving, for it seems that in this alternate universe, Big Tobacco had discovered perhaps the most insidious way to push their poisonous products onto people, making them seem irresistibly awesome. One poor child had to pay the ultimate price. No, more likely many had, in that horrific alternate universe that should not exist. And horribly, a foul artifact of that universe had made it into ours. And now, even as I mourn this revelation, I can't stop smoking. I need to get help about this, but just in case I don't live much longer, I'm leaving this record of what happened. A record poor Ike didn't manage to leave. Or if he did, I didn't see it. I wish I could post this recount right by the aging Sega Saturn to warn anyone about this game. Of course, if I ever had the opportunity to go back there, I might just destroy the game. But seeing as I can't stop smoking, I ask myself, would I? Or would I just resume playing that evil game again? I fear it is so. Maybe it's too late for me, but it's not too late for anyone reading this. Don't play a game starring Joe Camel, or it is you who will be played. Don't smoke camels, or it is you who will be smoked. And if you ever manage to figure out multiverse travel for yourself, be wary of what you bring back into this universe.
I used to love fighting games until my friend brought over a video game that terrified me. I hadn't seen my friend Joseph in over 4 years. The last time I saw him was when I dropped him off at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. He was taking an airplane straight to Japan. After years of trying, Joseph finally managed to get a work visa and would teach English in Tokyo. Going to Japan had always been Joseph's lifelong dream. When I saw him walking toward the airport, he was bouncing on his feet. He was so happy he almost looked like he was floating. Floating like a cartoon character who had just smelled a delicious pie sitting on an open windowsill and was now hovering towards it. Before walking through the sliding doors, Joseph turned towards me and gave me a wave. Bright, wet tears glinted around the edges of his eyes, but they were tears of pure joy. He looked like a man who was finally about to start the rest of his life. I waved back at my friend and watched him walk away. The man who returned 4 years later resembled a tattered scarecrow more than he resembled my friend. It was Joseph who introduced me to fighting games. This was back when Joseph and I were 12 years old. At the time, I was only aware of a few fighting games. Mortal Kombat, which I'd only played briefly when I was very young, but I loved the movie, and the Nintendo games Super Smash Bros. And Super Smash Bros. Melee, which I had dabbled in.
Smash isn't a fighting game,
Joseph said to me one day.
although Melee isn't bad.
Joseph introduced me to games like Tekken, Street Fighter, Marvel vs. Capcom, King of Fighters, Dead or Alive, Virtua Fighter, etc. Even at such a young age, Joseph was already a connoisseur of fighting games and talked about them the way a pretentious film student might talk about French films. When he found a fighting game he liked, he obsessed over it and made it a part of his personality. Joseph adored fighting games, knew them front to back. He didn't even play them with a controller. He played them with a fight stick, which was essentially a portable arcade setup. I had tried it once, but it hurt my fingers using it. But Joseph played that fight stick like a maestro pianist played some grand concert. Sometimes I would just listen as he played. Listen to the soft clackety-clack of the buttons. It really was like music. It was Joseph who taught me that fighting games weren't just games where you mindlessly mashed buttons on your controller until either you or your opponent's health was depleted. No, Joseph showed me that fighting games were more sophisticated than that.
Fighting games are like chess.
Joseph told me one day after trouncing me in Tekken 4.
It's all about anticipating your opponent's next 3 moves, conditioning them to think you're going to do one thing, and then you do the other. It's about patience and timing. Don't just attack. Don't just think about what you're doing. Think about what I'm doing.
I want to do sick combos like you, Joe, I had said. When are you going to teach me that?
Combos are like the icing on the cake, dude.
Joseph said, slapping me on the back.
But you have to learn how to bake the cake first.
I never became quite as passionate about fighting games as Joseph. Maybe I would have if not for the bowling alley incident. A couple years later, when Joseph and I entered high school, we finally decided to go to a local fighting game tournament. It was the first time we had ever gone to a local. I was shocked when Joseph said that he had never been to one before, but he simply shrugged.
First time for everything, dude.
Joseph was going out with a girl named Kathy at the time, and she accompanied us to the local. Kathy didn't care much for fighting games at all, but she wanted to go to support Joseph. The tournament occurred in a room in the back of a bowling alley. As we walked into the room, I immediately felt something was wrong. I had a feeling that one might have when walking straight into a lion's den, with freshly cut meat hanging around their neck. Joseph and I had both signed up for the Street Fighter pool. Joseph's first opponent was a man much older than us. He had terrible hygiene and wore a stained gray tank top and camo cargo shorts. He had a greasy-looking face, and he smelled horrible too. But it was the look on his face that shocked me. He looked relentlessly angry for no reason at all, and more than once I saw him leer at Kathy with his angry, pinched eyes. Kathy was the only girl there. The man called himself Clyde, although he spelled the E with a 3.
This should be easy,
Clyde said.
Love breaking in the newbies. Fucking piece of cake.
But Clyde never got a chance to do any breaking in because Joseph completely trounced him. A clean 2-0 sweep. It had never been close either. Joseph handled him like a pro baseball player taking pitches from a little leaguer. Clyde never stood a chance. There was a look of utter shock on everyone's faces, as apparently Clyde had been one of the better players in the pool, the favorite to win the whole thing, and now he was going to the losers bracket.
Good game,
Joseph said to Clyde, reaching his hand out. I grimaced, thinking how horrible it must feel to shake Clyde's greasy hand.
Whatever,
Clyde said, turning away from Joseph's outstretched hand like it was diseased. He got up and threw his controller on the ground.
Fucking beginner's luck, asshole. I fucking hate this game. I hate the way you play.
That was amazing,
Kathy said, wrapping her arms around Joseph.
You were so good.
Fuck you, cunt,
Clyde said. and his words cut through the air. There was a moment of shocked silence. I had expected the other older players in the room to stand up and say something, but most just looked down or away. Some were saying obscene things about Kathy. Others even snickered and muttered under their breaths.
"What did you say?"
Geoff said. And for the first time in my life, I saw pure rage on his face. Rage like I had never seen before.
Joe, just leave it,
Kathy said.
Yeah, just leave it, Joe.
Clyde said, and a ghoulish grin crossed his face. He made an obscene jerk-off motion with his hand.
Listen to your cunty girl.
Clyde was older than us, but Geoff was tall for his age. Joseph's fist shot out and connected with Clyde's dumb face. Clyde stumbled back, and for a moment, his angry, greasy face was replaced by one of pure shock. Then the anger returned, and the brawl started. We walked out of the horrible-smelling bowling alley with our heads hung low. The bowling alley manager, a bald man named Todd who smelled like old cigarettes, came in and broke up the fight. When asked who was responsible, Clyde and all the other players in the room pointed at us. Todd told us that we were banned for life from ever coming back and wouldn't listen to our protests. I never even got to fight my match. On our walk home that night, Kathy had tried apologizing to Geoff, but he assured her that she had done nothing wrong, that he was sorry that he had let his anger get the best of him, that he was sorry she had been called those things, and that he was sorry for even suggesting they go to the local tourney. Kathy accepted everything Geoff said graciously, but their relationship was never quite the same, and they broke up a few weeks later. That night left a bad taste in my mouth that would never quite leave. My experience with fighting games had been nothing but positive until that point. I had expected the local tournament to be a fun experience, a place where we could hang out with like-minded individuals, make new friends. But the other players at the tournament seemed shrewd, mean-spirited, and very angry. But angry at what? The world? What were they all so damn angry about? I couldn't stop seeing Clyde's horrible pinched face.
"Fighting games are awesome,"
Geoff had said that night.
"But man, some of the players suck."
Geoff had kept in contact pretty frequently during his first year in Japan. He would send me emails and WhatsApp texts discussing the cultural differences between Japan and the USA. He would tell me how he thought his school co-workers hated him, but his class loved him. He would describe to me in great detail all the delicious foods he was eating and the amazing walks he would go on at night, how much he truly loved it there. And yes, he would also send me videos of him playing fighting games, many of which had never even gotten a US release.
"It's like heaven over here, dude,"
Geoff said to me in a text one day.
"Fighting game nirvana."
I started to lose contact with Geoff. His emails became less frequent, and it was usually only a sentence or two when he replied to me, sometimes even less.
"Doing good." "Yeah, that's cool." "Okay, sounds good." "Sure. Yeah, I'm good." "Yep."
By 2020, I had lost contact with him completely. He didn't have any family left in the town I lived in, and I didn't know anyone else in Japan who could check on him or tell me how he was. The last email he sent before he completely stopped contacting me was only one sentence.
"I think I found a really good fighting game."
It was in late February when Geoff contacted me. 2 years since I had last heard from him. When I saw the email in my inbox, I almost didn't believe it was real. The contents of the email were sparse. He was coming back to the US in March and wanted to know if he could stay at my place when he came back. He had changed numbers and was sorry for not being in touch more. I replied that he absolutely could stay at my place and asked him how he was. His only response was the date he'd be coming to town. I shot him an email offering to pick him up from Chicago O'Hare, but he said he would take the bus into town instead. Oh, and that he couldn't wait to play a new fighting game with me. It was on March 16th that I saw Geoff again. I was waiting at the bus stop when around 8 p.m., a long, tired-looking Greyhound bus pulled in. I watched as the passengers disembarked and retrieved their luggage. There weren't many people. A couple of college kids, an older couple, a man dressed in a fine business suit. The last person to get off the bus was a rail-thin man who wore all black. He had greasy, slicked-back hair, sunken eyes, and a pale face. I was confused because I was sure Joseph said he would be on the 8 o'clock bus, but my friend was nowhere to be found. Then, after retrieving his luggage, the man with the greasy, slicked-back hair waved at me. It was Joseph. When Joseph began walking toward me, I almost fainted. He looked nothing like the man I had dropped off at the airport 4 years ago. Instead, he looked like some pallid scarecrow slowly descending upon me. He had always been a skinny guy, but now he was skeletal, and the clothes he was wearing, a black sweatshirt with a black tee underneath, black jeans, and black boots, were in contrast to the colorful jackets and shirts he used to wear. And deep purple bags were under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But when he smiled and held out his arms for a hug, there was still a ghost of the old Joseph in there, which put me at ease a little. But only a little.
Long time no see, dude,
Joseph said with a sickly grin. His voice was hoarse, like he had been at a concert the night before, screaming his lungs out. We embraced. On the car ride, we exchanged the normal pleasantries and talked the usual talk of two friends who had become strangers, trying to find a rhythm with each other again. Like two bandmates who had not played with each other for years, we were trying to slip back into old ways when the music had been good. And then Joseph explained that he had gotten really busy with work, the pandemic, and everything going on, and that he had simply lost touch.
You know how it is, right, dude?
Joseph said. Sure. Yeah, I get that. No worries, man.
Oh, I'm not worried,
Joseph responded curtly, and there was a defensiveness to his voice that I had never heard before.
Far from it. I'm done working overseas now. I got something big planned. Yes, sir.
Really? Like what? I asked, genuinely curious. Joseph had yet to explain what work, if any work, he'd be doing now that he was back in the States.
You'll see,
Joseph said, and there was a devilish gleam in his eyes. I merely nodded bemusedly. So, tell me about this new fighting game, I said. The devilish gleam in Joseph's eyes was gone instantly. It was replaced with what I can only describe as the look of a starving man who has now come across an all-you-can-eat buffet. Only, it's not really a buffet. It's 3-day-old roadkill. But to a starving man, what's the difference? It was a ferociously hungry look.
Wait until you see it, my man. Just wait until you see.
We stopped at a gas station. I filled up, and then Joseph said he wanted to go in to grab a Red Bull and some snacks. I offered to buy it, and we both went in together. After we had gathered the goods, we waited in line at the register. An older customer was talking to a young man behind the counter. They had an easygoing repertoire with each other. If Joseph and I had sounded like bandmates who were out of practice, then these two sounded like bandmates who played nightly gigs together. I was instantly aware that the old man must be a regular at the gas station. The old man was holding up the line, but I had no problem with letting him finish his conversation. The conversation they were having was actually quite funny, and I was beginning to laugh myself.
Hey, you old fuck, can you hurry it up?
I turned to Joseph, shocked. He was glaring at the old man, leering at him. It reminded me in many ways of how Clyde had leered at Kathy all those years ago, and Joseph was wearing that same angry, pinched face. Dude, not cool, I began to say, but Joseph pushed past me. The Red Bull he had been holding was now in a grip as if he meant to swing it at any second.
If you're not buying anything, then get the fuck out of line,
Joseph continued. People in the gas station were looking at us now. The old man simply looked down, ashamed, as if he'd been caught doing something bad. I'm sorry, the old man said weakly. Just like talking with my pal here,
I don't fucking care.
Joseph said.
Get out of line, now.
The old man moved aside. The young man behind the counter looked like he wanted to say something, but simply mumbled something under his breath. I paid him for our drinks and snacks, and then walked out of the gas station, more embarrassed than I'd ever been.
Fucking cunts, am I right?
Joseph said when we got back in the car. Sure, I said, like an idiot. I was too embarrassed to say anything else, and honestly, too intimidated to challenge Joseph in any way. Joseph had always been an agreeable person. We had hardly ever gotten into fights as kids. I mean, how could you fight with Joseph? He had always been so cool, so chill. The idea of disagreeing with him felt wrong, even now, when he was acting like a stranger. And he was still holding the Red Bull in a death grip.
Are you ready?
Joseph was sitting cross-legged in the middle of my apartment. He had barely taken time to get situated. He simply threw his luggage in one corner of the living room and then pulled a white square slip out of his sweatshirt. Is that it? I asked, pointing at the white slip. The fighting game I've been hearing so much about?
Sure is,
Joseph said. He put his hands into the white slip and produced a gray disc. There was no cover art on the disc, no logo. The only thing on the front of the disc were 2 words written crudely in black marker. It read, "Fighting Game." Seriously? It's called Fighting Game? I said, trying to hold back laughter. But I didn't laugh too much. I didn't want Joseph to think I was laughing at him. I was still thinking about the gas station incident. And the disc looks so bootleg.
That's just a working title,
Joseph said.
And forget about the disc art. You've never seen anything like this game before. It puts Tekken, Street Fighter, KOF, all those frauds to shame.
Joseph inserted the disc into my PS5, and the console immediately began making noises like an airplane engine. I gave Joseph a terrified look. I had spent weeks trying to get a PS5 back in December, and now it sounded like whatever Joseph stuck inside of it was destroying it. Joseph saw the look of concern on my face and held up a hand as if to say, chill out. Why didn't you chill out at the gas station, Joe? Is what I wanted to say. I kept quiet. Eventually, my PS5 stopped sounding like a plane about to lift off and eased back into a quiet, steady rhythm. A thumbnail appeared on the PS5 homepage. It was a blank disc. The usual thumbnail when the PS5 is reading something that's not officially licensed or that it's not aware of. Joseph picked up the controller and clicked on the thumbnail. The game started. Unlike most fighting games, Fighting Game had no cinematic intro showing off all the cool characters. Instead, we were shown a black screen with white text that simply read, "Press any button to start." Joseph did. Then another black screen with white text. Single player, multiplayer. Joseph clicked on multiplayer and threw me the other controller. Faintly, I was aware of how wrong Joseph looked holding a controller. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him use a controller instead of the fight stick. He took a quick glance at his luggage, but it didn't look like he had brought a fight stick with him. It was like the Joseph in front of me was some bizarro version of him that came from another dimension. Then we were shown a curious thing on the screen. Most fighting games will let you choose what stage you want to play in from various options, and most fighting games will give you multiple characters to choose from. Most games will start off with something like 5 to 10 characters at launch. But Fighting Game only presented us with one stage on the screen. There was a picture of a bar, and underneath the image it read, Manchester, England, bar. And there were only 2 characters to choose from underneath that. One was a man wearing a red Manchester United jersey, the other was a man wearing a blue Manchester City jersey. Joseph saw my curious look and said,
The stage and characters change every time you start a new match. It's always a new location, with 2 new characters to choose from. Wild, right? Here, I'll take the guy in blue.
And he selected the man in the Manchester City jersey. That left the man in the red Manchester United jersey. I selected him. What followed next is what I can only describe as the greatest fighting game I have ever played. Not only were the graphics some of the most photorealistic graphics I'd ever seen, but the gameplay itself was masterful. There were no supernatural movesets in fighting game, no energy blasts or anything like that. The game had a realistic fighting style that was more akin to a UFC game than a traditional fighter, but the movement was smooth. Movement is a big appeal in fighting games. You never want your characters to feel too heavy or too light. Fighting games struck the perfect balance. You could also interact with the stage, picking up stools or whatever was by you and hitting your opponent with it. At the end of the match, Geoff picked up a pool stick and impaled me with it, depleting what was left of my health bar. Blood ran down the pool stick as "Game Over" appeared on the screen, which was then replaced by the word "rematch." We played several more matches, and just like Geoff said, every time we started a new match, we were given a new location with 2 new characters to choose from. The locations ranged from all over the world, from Australia to China to Ireland to Russia, etc. One stage was set in a church in Brazil, and the characters were a priest and a nun. The characters were always specific to the location in some funny way like that. At least, at the time, I thought it was funny. Knowing what I know now. And for the first time that night, Geoff felt like the old Geoff again. We laughed gleefully as we played. He even gave me tips like back in the old days. I started getting a good hold of the game when something strange happened. The next stage was set in the US. It was not the first stage we played that had been set in the US, but it was significant for a few reasons. The stage was set in a gas station, a familiar-looking gas station. Underneath the image, it simply read, "Wisconsin, United States, gas station." We were in Wisconsin. And the 2 characters? Can you guess? One was an old man, and the other was a younger man wearing what looked like a gas station uniform. The 2 characters looked too familiar. But it can't be them, I told myself. That was impossible. We were just playing a video game, right? A stupid bootleg fighting game that Geoff brought over from Japan. Dude, am I crazy? I began to say. Or do those guys look like the guys we saw earlier tonight? Geoff stared at me and then broke out into laughter. It was a horrible sounding laugh. A mean-spirited laugh. A laugh that said, "Joke's on you, fuckface." The same laughter Clyde and the boys spewed at us as we walked out of the bowling alley that night.
You're crazy,
Geoff said.
Here, I'll take the young guy. You get the old man.
Geoff destroyed me. I mean, he utterly destroyed me. I watched in horror as the young gas station attendant stomped on the old man's head and then threw his face into the icy machine. When the match was over, Geoff let out an exhaustive, almost orgasmic sounding scream. And Geoff had seemed so angry and determined while playing, like a man on a mission.
There,
Geoff said.
How do you like that, you old fuck?
A kind of unreality began to wash over me. It all started to feel wrong. I began to feel lightheaded. I could hear Geoff laughing and cheering in triumph, but he sounded far away. Then, gathering myself, I told him I was done playing for the night.
Sure thing, dude,
Geoff said as I walked towards my room.
I'm gonna play for a bit more. Wild game, right?
That night, I had a terribly vivid dream. I was back in the bowling alley from all those years ago. I was walking out with Geoff and Kathy, our heads hung low, and everyone else in the room was pointing and laughing at us. Only it's not Joseph and Kathy anymore. It's the old man and the gas station attendant. Both of their faces are bloodied and bruised. And there's another Joseph in the room. An older Joseph with greasy, slicked back hair and deep, sunken eyes. And he's standing in the corner. And he's pointing at us and laughing with the rest of the crowd. Laughing so wide it looks like he's screaming. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. Dim sunlight slanted through the blinds. I rubbed my eyes and, for a moment, was in that blissful state of ignorance when you wake up. And then it all came flooding back to me, when you really don't remember the events of the night before. Joseph, the gas station, fighting game. Joseph was sleeping on the couch when I walked into the living room. He hadn't even bothered to pull out the bed. A PS5 controller was sitting idly on his chest. He was sleeping, but he looked like a corpse. The only sign that he was alive was a thin rattling sound that escaped his mouth. He sounded vaguely like a cat choking. I had had many sleepovers with Joseph over our childhood, and I don't remember him ever breathing like that. I turned on the TV and began to flick through the channels. I stopped when I came across the local morning news. My heart sank, and then it began to beat rapidly. There had been a fight at the gas station. No, not a fight. A murder. The news anchor described how a local 24-hour gas station attendant had been arrested for beating an elderly customer to death. They had a reporter on the scene who was interviewing a witness. "I've never seen anything like it, man," the witness told the reporter. "They just started fighting. I mean, out of nowhere. One minute they were talking, and the next they were at each other's throats. He clobbered the old dude. I mean, whooped him." When the reporter asked the witness if he or anyone else had tried to stop the fight, the witness said that he had simply watched, that it had never crossed his mind to step in. He said it had been like watching a movie or a video game. The witness began to look confused and told the reporter he didn't want to talk anymore. I turned the TV off. That same unreality from the night before began to wash over me. I looked over at the couch. Joseph was wide awake. And he was smiling.
Cat's out of the bag, dude.
This can't be real. My voice was thin. I was sitting in the corner of my living room, rocking back and forth. Joseph had just attempted to tell me what the deal was, what the game truly was, and what it truly did. How a man that he had met in Japan had given him the game. A man he greatly revered. A man that Joseph simply called Player One. But I couldn't believe it. Refused to believe it.
It's all real,
Joseph said. He was still grinning. His sunken eyes now looked wet and bright, and they were so very wide. You expect me to believe that all those matches we played, all those fights, those were all real people. In my head, I saw two men in a UK bar fighting to the death. One in a red Manchester United jersey, the other in a blue Manchester City jersey. Not video game characters, but real men. I saw a priest and a nun fighting in a church in Brazil. I saw all the countless people we had controlled the night before. Not characters, but people. And the thing all these people had in common? The terrified look on their faces. Terrified because they had suddenly lost complete control of their bodies.
You saw the news report yourself,
Joseph said, spreading his hands.
You knew it when you saw the gas station in the game last night.
You told me it wasn't them! I yelled.
I didn't want to freak you out,
Joseph said. Oh, mission fucking accomplished then, I said sarcastically. Did you Did you put them in the game somehow?
No.
Joseph said, and he sounded disappointed, as if he wished he could control who appeared in the game.
The game decides who becomes a selectable character. I was shocked to see them. Although it's not the first time. I've seen someone I know in the game. It's rare, but it happens.
And a terrible grin spread across his face. This is all wrong, I said.
We're doing God's work,
Joseph said, and that ferociously hungry look appeared on his face again. The look of a starving man about to chow on some roadkill.
That's what Player 1 said to me. What he taught me over the past 2 years. This game was given to us by God. And the players chosen are his sacrifices. It's his work. I know this is a lot to take in, but you have no idea what I've seen. If you just
get out! I hurled the words at Joseph. Joseph shrugged, as if he had been expecting this. I eyed my PS5 wearily. I knew that deep in its guts was the disc for fighting game, sitting in the console like some gray, dead tongue. I ran towards the console and hit the eject button. The disc lolled out of the console, and now it looked like a tongue with crude black marker written all over it. I grabbed the disc and snapped it in half. I turned towards Joseph, a triumphant look on my face. It died when I saw him. Joseph was smiling. Again, as if he had been expecting this. Then he walked over to his luggage and took out a black binder. He opened it and revealed countless gray discs. Pages and pages of them sitting in gray transparent sleeves, each one of them scrawled over with a black Sharpie. Each one of them read the same thing. Fighting game.
I told you, I have big plans,
Joseph said.
I really wanted you to be part of this.
I felt the Doritos and Red Bull from the night before coming up through my stomach. Joseph, that game, it's evil. Can't you fucking see that? We're the reason that the old man is dead. Jesus Christ.
You don't get it. It's God's...
Just get out, I yelled. Please, Joseph, just get out and don't come back. I can't be a part of this. Joseph looked actually hurt by this. His face scrunched up in a frown, and it sickened me that I saw my old friend again for a moment. The Joseph who had taught me everything about fighting games. Joseph who had been my closest friend. He looked genuinely hurt. But the look left as soon as it came, replaced by the grinning ghoul my friend had become. And there was another face there too, a relentlessly angry-looking face.
You're lost,
Joseph said, gathering his sparse luggage. He never let go of the black binder. He held it in a death grip the same way he had held the Red Bull can the night before. He walked towards the door and then turned towards me.
We don't choose who appears in the game. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll see you in there. Wouldn't that be a riot? But I wonder, should I choose to play as you? Or choose to fight you?
Get out. He left. I don't know where Joseph lives now. I haven't spoken to him, and I've only seen him once since then. It was about a month ago, in May. I was driving home and coincidentally drove past the old bowling alley. Although, maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe there was some part in my mind that knew he would be there. I knew that I needed to see him one last time. Joseph was there in the parking lot. He was wearing all black and was surrounded by at least a dozen men who were also wearing all black. And I swear one of them looked just like Clyde. He was older looking and balding, but he had the same pinched face. Each man had a controller or fight stick in one hand, and in the other hand, they were carrying a white slip. And I knew for certain that in each of those white slips was a gray disc with a crude black marker. Joseph was speaking to the men. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he appeared to be a drill sergeant speaking to fresh recruits. They all looked so angry at the world. There was another man there too. He was the only one not holding a controller or a disc. He was an incredibly tall and thin-looking man. He stood a little behind Joseph, with his arms behind his back. If Joseph was a drill sergeant, this man carried himself like a general. I watched Joseph, and I thought our eyes met for a split second. And then Joseph smiled that terrible smile. The last thing I saw before my car turned the corner was Joseph and the rest of the men marching into the bowling alley. I guess Joseph isn't banned anymore, or maybe Todd, the manager, just doesn't recognize him. They marched into that bowling alley, not like men about to play a video game, but like men who were going to go about some great work. God's work, I suppose. I don't play fighting games anymore.
When my mom passed away, I was the sole one responsible for cleaning up her house. I didn't have any siblings, and I didn't know my dad. As far as I knew, he was dead. So it fell on me to handle her affairs. I'm not the most organized person, so I have to say it was a pretty intimidating task. I started with the usual stuff, getting her affairs in order, taking care of the funeral arrangements, everything you have to do up until the body is buried. After that, it was just a matter of going through all of her stuff, piece by piece. To say my mom was something of a hoarder would be an understatement. Okay, so she was hardly reality TV worthy, but she hung on to a lot of junk. It was overwhelming going through everything, but I won't lie, it felt nice. Each little trinket was a memory. Even the tattered doily she saved brought back warm feelings of my childhood. Halloweens when she would lay it out on an end table where she kept the candy bucket. I spent a few days going through all of it. She had a shed in her backyard, a sizable thing where she kept most of her knickknacks. It was cold in that shed. Holes in its side let in freezing winds. I wore my thick jacket and worked into the night. Just me and the twin sounds of wind and shuffling boxes. Before long, I let my mind wander to the loneliness of my task and the decreasing light outside. I hadn't even realized it was getting so dark, and I kind of freaked myself out thinking about the wind whistling through the holes in the walls. I was more drained than I realized. There were plenty of boxes still to sort through, but only one left on the ground. Determined to finish this one and then enjoy my night, I lifted the lid and was pleasantly surprised. Inside was my old Nintendo and a stack of games. Now, I'm hardly a gamer. I have a current console, and I use it for one series that my friends and I play regularly, but that's about it. As a kid, we didn't have a lot of money, but I remember my mom splurging one Christmas and getting it for me. I only ever owned a few games, but I played the hell out of them. I remember my days bunny hopping in The Adventure of Link, and was really confused why they changed the gameplay for Legend of Zelda. A friend had to tell me that Adventure of Link actually came second, which blew my mind. Link was the main character. Why wouldn't they title the first game after him? I had 5, and I remembered them all too well. The warm feeling of sitting in front of our TV coming back to me as I pulled them out of the box and slid them out of their sleeves. That satisfying sound of plastic scraping against plastic. bringing a smile to my face. Final Fantasy, where I spent hours trying to perfect the right party. Adventure Island, which I always replayed just to use the skateboard. Ninja Turtles, which I beat as every character. There were 5 that I remembered so vividly, so I was surprised when I pulled out the 6th game. The cartridge was black instead of the usual gray, which seems like it should have sparked my memory right then and there, but it didn't. It didn't help that the title on top of the cover had been worn away, leaving me with just the art. As I stared at the image of a sinister figure clutching a tombstone as he rose from an open grave, it came back to me. I used to play this game every day. I enjoyed it because it was kind of dark. It felt like a forbidden thing that I shouldn't have been allowed to play. The whole thing took place at night, and I remembered having to explore a dark castle to kill a demon. Thinking about it, I couldn't recall exactly what made it so dark, because it wasn't like Final Fantasy didn't have skeletons and monsters. That really annoyed me. It's like trying to remember someone's name that you see every day, but it's stuck in the back of your head. For something I had played all the time, it was unacceptable that I couldn't remember more than first entering that imposing castle, let alone its title. Right then, I decided I needed to try it out again. I wanted to relive those glory days and find out what I'd forgotten. In my head, that castle was an imposing sight, fully realized in beautiful graphics. Part of me just wanted to see how much of my memory was tainted by rose-colored glasses. There were 2 old CRT TVs in the shed, but only the small black one worked. I set it down on a bar stool, plugged it into an extension cord, and ran that along the floor to the only power outlet in the shed. I also hooked the Nintendo up, attached the AV cables to the TV and the controller to the console. Everything powered on just fine. I stared at the fuzzy penguins on the TV, a little joke my mom and I had that the static looked like a bunch of jumbled up fuzzy penguins. I pressed the channel button until I switched to channel 3 and was met with a black screen. I was feeling kind of excited as I pulled the cartridge from its sleeve. It reminded me of Christmas morning, getting a new game each year. My mom was always so happy watching me unwrap it. She always knew just what I wanted because she'd bring home old issues of Nintendo Power from the houses she cleaned, and I'd tell her stories about all the cool games I saw. Of course, I was always behind the times on the new cool games, but I didn't care because I loved what I had, no matter if everyone else had already played them. The lid popped up with a satisfying click. The spring squeaked ever so slightly. The mystery cartridge slid in, plastic scraping the sides of the machine, chipset clicking in. I pressed down, pushed the game into position, and hit the reset button. Nothing happened. I was still staring at a black screen. Panic rushed through me. Not a real or earned panic, but panic all the same. The thought that I might not get to play this game and have to forever go without being able to remember the title filled me with existential dread. It's hard to let stuff like that go without it nagging at you forever. I breathed and told myself it would work, pulling out the cartridge and doing the same thing every kid with a Nintendo was all too familiar with. I blew into it. It looks like you're trying to play it like a harmonica, but it gets the job done. Lo and behold, I popped it back in, pressed the reset button, and the screen flashed as the game booted to the title screen. But it was just an image of that imposing castle. How could a game not include its title on the title screen? It didn't make any sense. There was only one option on the main screen. Press start. So I pressed it and was met with an ominous beep. Music began, a bass-filled chiptune like an operatic orchestra. I'd never heard anything like it. Didn't even think it was possible to make something that wasn't high-pitched on an 8-bit system. The screen faded out with a pixelated wash of colors. No text boxes explained my quest. I was just dumped into a forest. A white square sat empty at the top of the screen. My character looked average. just wearing plain pants and a shirt. He looked nothing like the typical fantasy heroes, knights in armor or Belmonts carrying whips. I hit the right arrow and my character started walking while I checked out what my buttons could do. A, jump, but B did nothing. My character didn't seem to have an attack. I didn't remember jumping on enemies to kill them, but then again, I didn't remember much of the game at all. For an NES game, the forest was creepy as hell. It started with a low layer of fog across the ground, an impressive effect for the time it was made. Bats flapped toward my character, and he ducked underneath them. The further in he got, the worse the forest became. Skulls hung from trees, candles in their eye sockets burning away. Headless skeletons burst out of the ground. I hit jump and my character landed on a skeleton, managing only to hurt himself. That obviously wasn't how I killed things. He hopped over to the rest and continued along the path. I was expecting a boss, but the character reached the edge of the screen, went black, and the music stopped. Pretty anticlimactic. But I was in for a treat. This was what I remembered. The music came back, low and moaning like Gregorian chanting, as my character approached the massive castle featured on the title screen. The drawbridge lowered as my character approached. I felt uneasy stepping across the wooden bridge. The music stopped, unsettling me as all I could hear was the wind creaking through the holes in the shed and the trees overhead whipping the roof. The screen changed as the character stepped past the gate, and then he was inside the castle, greeted by a terrifying digital screech of pain. The noise almost made me stop playing, the high pitch at once grating and frightening at the same time. It felt real, like the developers had digitized an actual recorded scream. But more than that, I could feel the pain behind it. I depressed the right arrow button and continued trudging on. The castle was nicely lit, almost welcoming if it hadn't been for that scream. There were no enemies at all. The level continued scrolling until I hit a staircase, and the game took control and sent my character down the steps. The screen transitioned out into a courtyard full of tombstones. It was a veritable graveyard with a spooky tree that reminded me of the spindly-limbed oak in my mum's backyard. A set of tombstones ripped themselves up from the earth and stacked together into a walking sepulchre. The music roared with a tune fitting for a boss. The walking tombstone monster spewed bones out at my character, which had a startlingly hard pattern to avoid. I could already tell that this was one of those games that didn't go easy on the player. I hoped maybe it was just one of those obnoxiously difficult first bosses, because I didn't really feel like spending all night in the shed. It didn't take me long to get into the swing of things, though. In fact, it felt like muscle memory in action, as I deftly dodged all the bones without taking a single hit to my character. When the first barrage was finished, I noticed a flashing bone left behind on the ground, and walked my player over to it. Voila! I had my first weapon, a bone icon neatly filling the white box at the top of the screen. I pressed B and launched a bone in a downward arc. It smacked the tombstone boss, and its body flashed bright white for a moment, satisfyingly marking a successful hit. Each salvo gave me a single bone to hurl at the boss. I missed once when the thing started flashing red and changed its attack pattern, adding a jump into its repertoire, but otherwise it was a perfect run, and the boss finally crumbled before my character. A grave was left unearthed in the ground. Certainly they wanted to go inside, but my instincts told me to stay put, because who would hop into an open grave? But the game didn't give me a choice, because it took control of my character again, and he walked over, jumping right into the hole. The screen turned black, and level 2 appeared on the screen. My character dropped down into a dark cave. Right away, I noticed something was very off. I was in a dungeon, not all that different from those I had seen before, but the decorations were very advanced and far more detailed than I thought possible. Chains lined the walls, torture instruments too. I had to jump onto a pillory and use it as a platform to reach a higher floor. I couldn't shake how dark this felt for an NES game. Robed men carrying whips charged at my character. I had to duck beneath their attacks and then jump over their heads to continue. My character barged through a door and I continued on as normal. Candles lighting the dungeon walls grew dimmer with each passing step. There were dark splotches of purple on the walls that I could barely make out, which I took to be an artistic choice to add depth to the otherwise blue tones of the dungeon. I waited, jumping in place like I usually did whenever I had to wait for a game to continue. Then everything faded to black except my character. The boss appeared faintly at first, blinking into existence. Then he flashed onto the screen, fully visible and horrific. Despite the pixel art, I could still tell that this giant man was supposed to be an executioner. He was covered in bloodstains and wore a black hood. A tremendous axe was in his hands, dripping with little red pixels. The background came back on screen, and my eyes went wide. Even by today's video game standards, this wasn't tame. There were severed heads and viscera everywhere, gutted bodies hanging up on chains. One person was still alive, his legs missing, his torso disemboweled, and yet I saw his sprite screaming and clawing towards the screen as if begging for me to help him. The executioner laughed. I was in a bit of a daze and took some hits from the boss, but I got his pattern down quickly. I had to run forward whenever he jumped and slammed his axe down to get underneath the weapon. Just like the Tombstone boss, each impact of the axe would create a flashing stone pickup on screen that I could throw at the executioner. It only took 6 hits to kill him, and the whirlwind attack he added when he was close to death was dodged simply by ducking. My character walked off screen and text flashed again on a black background, telling me I was on level 3. It looked like I was still in the dungeon, but things had gone from bad to worse. I realized now that those purple blotches I thought were shadowed bricks were bloodstains. The torture devices were filled with squirming people, their digitized voices begging for release. The enemies looked like more of the same torturers, but dressed in leather armor instead of robes. However, I soon realized that their outfits were scandalously made of straps, and they appeared to have their genitals exposed as well as they could be by 8-bit graphics. Whenever one of the enemies approached me, he would whip the victim if there was a torture victim between him and my character. Chunks of flesh would break off in showers of blood, and little pixels representing their skin landed on the ground. Exposed bone would be left behind from their flensed skin. I accidentally hit B when I meant to jump, taking a hit from a guard as he ran into me. Then I realized a bone icon filled the weapon square. The torture victim my character was standing in front of had a hole in their leg where their femur used to be. I almost felt disgusted when I realized I had been the one to rip it out. I kept going, throwing the bone at one point, just wanting to get it out of my character's hand. I needed to finish this level. I needed to see how far this game went. I couldn't imagine it getting much worse, yet I was starting to remember bits and pieces here and there. The dungeon seemed familiar, and I even thought maybe I remembered the torture victims, but my young mind hadn't processed what was happening or how terrible it was. What I found most alarming was the thought that my mom would have allowed me to play such a game. It took me longer than it should have to make it out of the dungeon. I was distracted by the sprites actively being tortured in the background art, being stretched out on wheels or burned alive or shoved into Iron Maidens. But I got through it all and reached the end of level 3, grateful that there wasn't a boss waiting for me. What was there was so much worse. Level 4 started with a pair of sprites, 2 flesh-toned characters I took to be humans, but one was massive. The giant one was thrusting into the smaller character. I retched in disgust as the big creature stepped away from the small one, leaving it a pile of gore. It laughed and ran away, and I finally had enough. I turned the machine off angrily. It was too much for me. It went beyond the realm of a video game and into pure tastelessness. I flicked the light switch and went to the house. I needed to calm down a little bit. My adrenaline was pumping. I felt like a little kid seeing something completely forbidden. It was probably how I felt when I actually had been a kid playing that garbage game. I wanted to find out what it was called, once and for all. After having a drink, I got online and started doing a search. I tried maybe 36 permutations of search terms, anything I could think of to describe the game or the cover art, but nothing came up. I'd found stuff this way before, but no matter how many details I gave, nothing came up that matched. I would get Castlevania or games like that, articles about games banned for violence and sex, but nothing similar to what I had just played. It was like the game didn't exist. That got me thinking that I had something special on my hands. Maybe it was greed, but if this game was one of a kind, some ultra-rare cartridge that next to no one knew about, I could make some decent money to help pay for all my mom's expenses. I saw a picture of us together on her mantel and smiled at it. I never realized how odd it seemed that the corner of the picture looked like it was missing someone. Maybe an hour passed, and I returned to the shed to retrieve the game. I stepped inside and flicked the lights on. The TV came on instantly. Weirdly enough, the NES did too, without me touching anything. The game booted to the start screen. I stepped over to turn the machine off, but before I could touch the controller, there was the same ominous beep I had heard when pressing the start button, and the game began. I thought that maybe it was playing a demo, like how a lot of those older games used to do. The problem with that theory was that the character on screen wasn't moving. He just stood there in his yellow shirt and blue pants right where I had left him. Curiosity forced my hand, and I picked up the controller. As I expected, this level got even worse. The torture became sexual in nature, sprites in the background forcing themselves on others in masses of pixelated flesh. The enemies appeared to be nude women bound in bondage gear. Their limbs twisted so that all they could do was walk towards me and make anguished groaning noises beneath their masks. About halfway through the level, I was given a whip, and used it to attack the bondage women, but it had the opposite effect than what I expected. The enemies squirmed and writhed when the whip attacked them, then just kept coming even as their sprites reddened with blood. I jumped and dodged the rest of the way, trying to ignore what I saw in the background and just focusing on reaching the end. A boss awaited me, the same big man from the beginning of the level. He was fast and constantly laughing every time he charged my character. He would lash out with a whip occasionally just to throw me off. I dodged, but no weapons ever appeared after a minute of this. The more I stared, the more I noticed my character. It was odd how unremarkable he was for a video game character. Brown hair, yellow t-shirt, blue pants. I looked down. It was actually exactly what I was wearing. In my distraction, I got rammed by the boss, but this wasn't a normal encounter. Normally, my character would flash, bounce back, and then be controllable again. When he touched me, the boss grabbed me and pushed me over this time. I lunged forward and turned off the console just in time to avoid the image on the screen. I breathed a sigh, utterly traumatized. Then the game came back. I had been staring at a black screen. Now my character was standing there like nothing had happened, being laughed at, and the boss's music was coming through the TV's tiny speakers. I leaned forward and turned off the TV. The button clicked beneath my finger, and the picture faded away. I couldn't believe my eyes, but the TV turned back on too. I told myself it had to be something up with the wiring. There was no other explanation. This time, I had a weapon in my hands. I noticed my health had a sliver left. Acting quickly, I pounded the B button, throwing daggers at the boss until he died. It was over, and the game moved on to the next level. But I'd had enough. I hit the power button on the console, but the light remained on no matter how many times I pressed it. I did the same to the TV, but it wouldn't turn off. I tried unplugging them both, but they stayed on. By this point, I was breathing heavily and completely freaked out. I pulled the AV cables out of the TV, hoping that would stop it. Certainly there was no way for the console to display its image on the TV if no cables were connected. No such logic there. I got up and switched off the power to the shed. The lights turned off, and I felt a rush of relief for a moment. But I saw the screens glow out of the corner of my eye and knew it was still on. Angry now, I popped open the lid and pressed down the cartridge, fully willing to just rip the thing out. But the mechanism wouldn't release. It was completely stuck. That was fine. I could just leave it on and let it sit. I didn't have to play. Except my character started moving even though I wasn't touching anything. I watched him travel through a short dungeon corridor, expecting horrible things. Surprisingly, my character reached the end where a bright light was shining. He stepped through and was back outside. I wanted to see what was coming next. Maybe it was a stupid idea, but I picked up the controller. It looked like the start of the game, but I assumed it was a new area. I didn't walk far before I approached a house. Not a medieval house, but just an average, modern suburban home. I grew up in a house like that. A house like my mom's. In fact, I was at that house right now. I walked to the door and went inside. It wasn't just like my mom's house. It was her house. The walls were painted the same. The furniture was the same. I swear there was a picture on the mantel that even looked like the two of us together. There were no enemies as I explored the living room. I noticed toys scattered on the floor, trucks and blocks. The TV was on, playing fuzzy penguins. The toys moved as I walked through them, kicking them out of the way. As I approached the TV, a dark shadow on the wall behind it twisted and moved until it turned into the shape of a dark figure with curved horns and sharp claws. The shape skittered along the wall, then jumped out towards me, crushing the toys on the ground. I ran, fearing for my life. It was artificial, but I felt like I was in real danger. The screen changed, and I entered the bedroom. It was a child's bedroom, walls papered with dinosaurs, more toys scattered across the ground. One toy stood out in particular, a teddy bear with its head ripped off. I looked over my shoulder at the open cardboard box of stuffed animals I had sorted through earlier that evening. My ripped-apart bear sat just on edge, barely in my view. I shook and looked back at the TV. As I approached the virtual bear, the toy lifted off the ground, the body first and then the head. The head twirled around in the air for a moment and then reattached itself. A moment later, the bear grew in size, or maybe I shrunk. The shadow creature's claws burst out of its hands, horns ripping through the top of its head. It chased me back the way I had come. The screen transitioned, not to the living room this time, but to a hallway. I found myself walking towards an open doorway. Outside, a female sprite was crouched down and crying, her face in her hands. I thought this was odd after everything else I had seen. In fact, the whole thing didn't make sense, but at the time, I wasn't really thinking about it. I just braced myself and entered the room. It was a bedroom, darkened save for a bolt of lightning coming from outside the window. The flash of lightning illuminated the shadow figure sitting sullenly on the bed. The room returned to darkness, and then another bolt filled it with lasting light. This time the shadow took on the shape of a man, completely normal looking. He looked up at my character, who was looking more and more like me by the second. I could tell the boss was glaring at me, even composed of simple pixels. He threw down a glass bottle which broke and then stood. I tried to move, but my sprite was frozen in place, just like I was as I watched the boss approach. I was definitely smaller than before and shrinking still, becoming no taller than a child. I watched as the boss removed a belt from his pants and held it tightly in his fist like a whip. He approached me, appearing to reach for the front of his pants. I wasn't sure if it was to hold them up or pull them down. Still frozen, unable to think, unable to breathe, I watched in horror as the boss grabbed me and the screen faded to black. A tear ran down my cheek as I listened to the sound effects playing in the background. The crack of a belt and a child crying. The darkness faded, and I realized I had control again. The boss was sitting on the bed, facing away from me. I had a knife in my hand. I took a step forward, clenched my teeth, and pressed the B button as hard as I could, relishing it as the knife flew into the boss's back and killed him in one hit. He fell to the ground, blood spilling across the floor. The screen faded to black, and credits began to roll. Within moments, the background changed to the cemetery from the beginning of the game. Above them, the crooked tree loomed ominously, a crow nestled in it. Someone was digging. It was the crying woman, and she was shoveling dirt out of an unmarked grave as the boss lay dead beside it. I tried to make sense of the words on screen, but the names were garbled nonsense. I didn't care about solving this mystery anymore. My trembling hand reached for the power button on the console. This time, the thing turned off, and stayed off. I pulled the cartridge out as quickly as I could, putting it in its sleeve and shoving it away in the nearest box I could find. I packed the NES in with my other games and left the shed with the box in my hands. I couldn't get away from that shed fast enough. As I stepped outside, walking towards the house and the light from the back porch, I stopped by the old spindly oak tree, dead and missing all its leaves. I stared at the ground by its base, watching and waiting as if I expected something to happen. I closed my eyes, my whole body shivering, and then ran into the house. I still never learned the name of that game. I stopped looking after that night. I never opened the box I put it in again, just donated the whole thing. Playing that game reminded me that there were some memories better left buried.
Tales for Dark Nights.